Nuts have a strange reputation. They're high in fat and high in calories, which for decades made them seem like something to avoid if you cared about your heart or your weight. But the research on nuts and health, particularly over the last decade, tells a very different story. Eating a small daily handful of nuts is now one of the more consistently supported dietary habits in cardiovascular research. Let's walk through what actually happens in your body, what the evidence shows, and how much you'd realistically want to eat. What counts as a handful? Before getting into the research, it helps to define the amount, since most of the studies use a specific quantity. A typical serving used across nut research is around 28 to 30 grams per day, which is roughly a small handful, about a quarter cup, or somewhere around 20 to 24 almonds, 15 cashews, or 14 walnut halves, depending on the type. Some studies use slightly higher amounts, around 45 to 60 grams, but the 28 to 30 gram range is the most commonly referenced daily target in the research on long-term health outcomes. What happens to your cholesterol? This is one of the most consistently demonstrated effects across the research. A large systematic review and meta-analysis of 113 randomized controlled trials, involving over 8,000 adults, found that regular nut consumption at a median dose of about 45 grams per day produced measurable reductions in total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, the type most associated with artery clogging plaque, along with smaller reductions in triglycerides. Notably, this same large analysis found no significant effect on HDL cholesterol, the good cholesterol, meaning nuts appear to specifically lower the harmful lipid markers rather than broadly affecting all cholesterol measures. A separate meta-analysis focused specifically on people who were overweight or obese found similar results. Nut consumption significantly reduced triglycerides and LDL cholesterol in that population as well, without affecting total cholesterol, HDL, blood sugar markers, or blood pressure in that particular analysis. What happens to your heart disease and stroke risk over time? This is where the research becomes genuinely striking, particularly in large, long-term observational studies that followed people's actual health outcomes over years, not just their lab values. A meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies found that for every additional 28 grams of nuts eaten per day, researchers observed a 29% lower risk of coronary heart disease, a 21% lower risk of cardiovascular disease overall, and a 22% lower risk of all-cause mortality, meaning death from any cause during the study period, not just heart-related death. Stroke risk showed a smaller, non-statistically significant reduction in that particular analysis. A separate, more recent updated review pooling multiple meta-analyses found nut consumption was associated with reductions in cardiovascular disease mortality of roughly 19 to 25%, coronary heart disease mortality reduced by roughly 24 to 30%, stroke mortality reduced by roughly 17 to 18%, and all-cause mortality reduced by roughly 19 to 20%, when comparing people with the highest nut consumption to those with the lowest. It's worth being precise about what kind of evidence this is. Most of these striking mortality and disease reduction figures come from large observational cohort studies, meaning researchers tracked what people already ate and followed their health outcomes over years, rather than a trial where people were randomly assigned to eat nuts or not. This is valuable, consistent evidence across many large studies, but it's a different category from a randomized trial proving direct cause and effect. The cholesterol-lowering effects, by contrast, come specifically from randomized controlled trials, which is a stronger form of evidence for that particular outcome. What happens to blood vessel function? Beyond cholesterol numbers, some research has looked specifically at how well blood vessels function after regular nut consumption. A review of intervention studies found nut consumption was associated with an improvement in flow-mediated dilation, a measure of how well an artery widens in response to increased blood flow, and a marker of healthy endothelial function, of roughly 0.8 to 1 percentage point across several pooled meta-analyses. This suggests a possible mechanism beyond cholesterol alone for why nuts may benefit cardiovascular health, potentially supporting the blood vessel's own ability to relax and accommodate blood flow, similar in concept to some of the vascular research on nitric oxide and dietary nitrate covered in other videos on this topic. What happens to your blood sugar and diabetes risk? The evidence here is more mixed than the cardiovascular findings. Some meta-analyses of prospective studies found no significant association between nut consumption and the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, while separate meta-analyses of intervention trials found nut consumption modestly reduced fasting blood glucose, with reductions in the range of roughly 0.08 to 0.15 millimoles per liter. Put simply, nuts don't appear to meaningfully raise diabetes risk, and there's some evidence of a modest favorable effect on blood sugar in controlled trials, but this is a less dramatic and less consistent finding than the cholesterol and cardiovascular disease research. What happens to your weight? This is worth addressing directly, since it's the most common hesitation people have about eating nuts regularly, given their calorie density. Despite that calorie density, multiple meta-analyses have found that regular nut consumption did not significantly affect body weight. Researchers believe this may be explained by a few factors working together. Nuts are high in protein and fiber, both of which promote a feeling of fullness. A portion of the fat in whole nuts isn't fully absorbed due to the structure of the nut cell walls, and some research suggests people may unconsciously compensate by eating somewhat less of other foods on days they eat nuts. This doesn't mean nuts are calorie-free, or that portion size doesn't matter at all. But it does mean the intuitive fear that a daily handful of nuts will straightforwardly translate into weight gain isn't well supported by the actual research. Specifically for older adults, there's research looking at this question specifically in older populations, which is relevant given how much cardiovascular risk changes with age. A study following older adults in a Hong Kong-based cohort found an interesting nuance. The association between nut consumption and lower mortality wasn't statistically significant among participants with normal activities of daily living, but was significant specifically among participants with impaired activities of daily living, meaning those experiencing more physical limitation appeared to see a more measurable benefit. Researchers suggested that including nuts in the diet may help extend lifespan, particularly in older adults, who are already experiencing some decline in physical function, though this is one study and shouldn't be treated as the final word on the topic. Separately, a controlled trial specifically in older adults with overweight or obesity, average age around 65, tested 60 grams of mixed nuts daily over 16 weeks and found favorable changes in detailed cholesterol particle measurements beyond what standard cholesterol tests alone would show, using more advanced lipid particle analysis. This suggests the cardiovascular benefit may extend to more detailed markers of arterial risk than a basic cholesterol panel captures. Does it matter which nuts you eat? Most of the strongest research looks at nuts as a general category, or specifically at tree nuts and peanuts together, and results have generally been similar across both. Some studies focus on a single type. Almonds have their own dedicated body of research on cardiovascular risk factors, for example, but the overall pattern across the research doesn't suggest one specific type of nut is dramatically superior to the others for these cardiovascular outcomes. A mix of different nuts, as used in several of the studies described above, is a reasonable and well-supported approach, and it also provides a broader range of specific nutrients across different nut types. A few things are worth keeping in mind if you're deciding to add a daily handful of nuts to your diet. Unsalted or lightly salted varieties are generally preferable to heavily salted versions, particularly if you're also managing blood pressure. Roasted or raw both appear in the research, without a clear indication that one is dramatically superior to the other, though heavily processed nut products with added sugar coatings or significant oil content move further from what the research has actually studied. Nuts are also a common allergen, so this obviously doesn't apply to anyone with a nut allergy. And because nuts are calorie-dense even if they don't appear to promote weight gain in the research described above, a reasonable daily portion, around a small handful, consistent with what most of the research actually tested, is more supported than eating them without any portion awareness at all. Eating a small daily handful of nuts, somewhere around 28 to 30 grams, is associated with meaningful reductions in total and LDL cholesterol in randomized controlled trials, and with substantially lower rates of coronary heart disease, cardiovascular disease, and all-cause mortality in large long-term observational studies, without the weight gain that the calorie content might suggest. The strongest, most direct evidence is for cholesterol improvement. The disease and mortality risk reductions come from large, consistent observational research rather than randomized trials proving direct causation, which is worth keeping in mind, though the consistency across so many large studies is itself meaningful. For most people without a nut allergy, this is a well-supported, low-risk daily habit with a genuinely solid body of research behind it. Not a miracle food, but one of the more consistently validated dietary habits available.